everyone, have you encountered a situation in DBT where you're writing a logic like an SQL logic again and again, maybe in some form of a model or as a test or somewhere else? If yes, what if I tell you that you can write the logic once and use it multiple times? So yes, I'm suggesting reusing the SQL logic, and this is what exactly the DBT macro allows you to do. And this is actually what makes DBT macros very powerful feature in DBT, because you're just writing the logic once and reusing it, which is exactly what we need in while using DBT. If you're watching my video for the first time, then I am Radhika and this is my YouTube channel Datazard. We are continuing our DBT series here. Each week I dive into a DBT topic and we go from beginner level to the advanced level. If you're finding these videos helpful, then I would really appreciate you subscribing to my channel, hitting the like button and putting your feedback in the comments. This week we are going to discuss about macros in DBT, and now without further ado, let's get started. Now let us first try to understand what are DBT macros. In simple terms, DBT macros, they are reusable piece of code which are written in SQL and Jinja. Now you know that we are writing our logic in SQL, but we need to make it reusable, which means that we need to form some kind of a template which we can fill with multiple, let's say template for a model, template for a column, etc. so that we can just replace the values in this template depending on what model we want to apply this to or what columns we need to apply whatever the logic we are writing in SQL to. And we know that if you have watched my previous video, Jinja is a templating engine that can allow adding this kind of a logic. So this is a templating engine. So we can write logic in SQL, and whatever pieces in SQL, they are repeated logic. You just write those in Jinja. If you have not watched my previous video on Jinja, then I would highly recommend watching that one first, because if you know what Jinja is, what are the different syntaxes used, how you can write conditions, loops, etc. in Jinja, this video is a piece of cake for you. You just need to understand how to write Jinja in DBT and the work is done. So I highly recommend watching that video first and then coming back here. So the key idea for macros is we are just going to write the SQL logic once and we are going to reuse that logic multiple places. And if you have worked in programming languages before, then you would know that this is exactly what functions in programming languages do. You write the function once and use it multiple places. Now let us try to take an example for a function in Python. So I'm going to say def, I'm adding two numbers in this function. So I'm saying add number, this is my function name, and then I have arguments num1 and num2. Let's say we can just pass two arguments for now. Now I will just write the logic of what needs to be done with these two numbers. So I'm saying all I need is to do return num1 plus num2. This is a very basic example. I just want to show you the functionality and relate things with how things are working in DBT and programming languages, so you get that understanding. So please bear with me. So what we are trying to do is we have defined this function and now we can use it. Suppose that we have to add Suppose that we have to add 1 and 18. So what I will do is I will say add number, I will call my function and I will pass 1 and 80 as arguments. So 1 will go over here, 80 will go over here, and then we will just say 1 plus 80, return 80. So this function will return answer as 81. If we change the outputs, let's say 3 and 20. So again we just call add number. We pass 3 and 20, 3 goes in num1, 20 goes in num2, 3 plus 20 is 23 and the output for this one is 23. So what we are doing is we are using this functionality again and again, and all we are doing is just calling this function. So we are replacing these values with what we want to use and using the logic that we have defined here. Now this function was a very simple function with just one return statement. There could be multiple things that you are doing, multiple processing that you're doing in the function and then returning something, which makes things more useful because you don't have to write this logic again and again when you have to add 1 and 80, 3 and 20 or do whatever you want to do. So I hope I was able to explain you that how the DBT macros relate to functions in programming languages, and it gives you a clear idea of how things will work. Now let us talk about a few use cases for DBT macros, as in where you should be using macros. Now I'm just giving you few ideas, and the macros use case are not limited to just these ideas. You can apply it anywhere where you see that you're repeating an SQL logic or where repetition is happening. So the first use case is in standardizing the transformations. Now what does this mean? In DBT we have to apply transformations, and on string columns especially, most of the time what we do is when we get a string, then we try to convert this into lowercase, then we trim it, and then this is our final output. Now if you have, let us say, 50 data engineers working in your company, if you ask these 50 data engineers to standardize the string, what some people could do is they will just put the string in lowercase. Some would just trim the spaces. So some would do this, and some would follow this full thing where they are first putting everything in lowercase, then they are trimming the spaces, and then this will be the final output. Now if we have to standardize things as to how a string column should be cleaned up, then what we can do is we can create a macro for this. I will be showing you practically how this is done, but I just want to plant the seed of the use cases, and then we can see the practical implementations later on for each one of these use cases. So this is something that we can do with macro. We can define a macro where with any string column we have to follow this process, and we can apply these macros wherever we are working with those strings, and we have to apply these transformations or standardize those strings. So this was the first use case. Now for the second use case, we can enforce business logic using macros. If you have been working as a data engineer or in data space, you would have come across terms like active customers, churned user, net revenue, etc. And these definitions, or sometimes they differ within the company, like in different departments, they will have their own meaning to it. For example, for active users, let's say the company-wide definition should be any customer or any user who has logged in the last 30 days. But finance team might be using last 60 days because they don't know that this is the standard definition, or things have changed recently that company has started using 30 days, but they have not changed their dashboards to reflect this. Sales could be using last 90 days as their threshold for the last active days. So different teams could be using different definitions for active customers and thereby getting different numbers on their dashboards. And people would be asking like, why these numbers for the same thing, they vary across different dashboards. And most of the time it is because the business logic is handled differently at different places. But using macros, we can standardize this value. So what we will do is we can create a macro, and in this macro we can define this business logic and use this macro in the models so that we have the same definition. So let's say in the macro we have defined 30 days. So any user who has logged in the last 30 days is defined as an active user. Later on, if the company changes their active user definition from 30 days to, let's say, 45 days, then we just have one place to update. We just have to update this macro and not worry about the hundreds of different models that we have created. as to where we have to then now go and update each of those models with 45 days instead of 30 days. So we have two advantages using these things here. We are first standardizing the business logic across different departments in the company, and also we have just one place where we have to go and update the days in this particular case, and this will be applied across the different models. We don't have to go into each individual model and change the value. Again, we are going to see the practical implementation later on. Third use case is environment specific config. This is a really interesting one. Currently, let us go back to our Snowflake, and here if you see, we have staging. This is where our raw data exists. This is where we pulled data from AWS and stored, and then we created all of these models on top of this data. So bronze was just this data as is, then we did something for silver, then there were seeds, etc. So all of this, if you see, is happening in one database, that is HR Analytics. Now when you are working in companies, then you will always have at least two environments. One is a dev environment and another one is a prod environment. Sometimes in between there also is a staging environment, but let's not worry about that. Let's just consider that there are two environments, dev and prod. Now I will explain first the current flow. So we have this HR Analytics as our database. This is our database, and in this we have staging schema. Now when we are getting data from staging, we are building this into bronze model and silver model. These two are there currently, and these are also sitting in HR Analytics right now, and we were doing our dev work. But what we want now is, when we are doing our, like when we are in the developer environment, dev environment, then we want these bronze and silver to be created in a different database, and that DB should be called as dev underscore HR underscore analytics. This way we know that we are working on the dev branch, and this is the branch where the stakeholders do not have access to. This is where we can freely build new features, fix bugs, etc. And then when we are ready, then we push to prod, where different stakeholders can access this data or all of these models. So what we want is, in this DB, dev underscore HR underscore analytics, we want these bronze and silver models to sync in first, because this is where we want to do the development. And later on when we are pushing to prod, then the DB should be prod underscore HR underscore analytics. This will also ensure that when we are making changes, either fixing bugs or creating new features, new models, etc., then stakeholders are able to access it without any problems, so that they are only going to this DB and we are working on this dev DB. And again, these bronze and silver models will eventually be pushed into prod, but under a different database. So this is, all of this functioning seems complicated, but with the use of macros, it becomes really easy. We can define a macro and say that when we are working on these bronze, silver, etc. models, like we were defining schema. So let me go back to our DBT project, and here if you see, in our dbt underscore project.yaml file, we were defining the schema. So in a similar way, we can define the database as well, where we need to sync this to. And then depending on whether we are working into the developer environment, the dev environment, or we want to push it into prod environment, we can choose which database this should go to. And we are not hard coding things, because we are going to use macros here. So I'll show you this functionality as well. The last use case that I want to cover is the generic tests. In the generic test video, I mentioned that if we don't want to create these tests in the generic test directory, in test directory, then we can create these as macros, because these are essentially, like, these generic tests are essentially macros. We are filling in the model name, column name. So this is working similar to how a macro would work. So instead of putting generic test in the test folder, we can put these in the macros folder and use them the same way as we were using the generic test. I will show you an example to make you understand how this can be done, and it is very intuitive. Now, these are some of the use cases that we are going to cover. And like I said before, the use case for macros is not just limited to these. I just wanted to give you a basic understanding and basic idea of what you can do. And then you can take this further. Next thing that I want to cover is, like everything in DBT, where do we define macros? And how do we define macros? So macros, like everything else in DBT, are also SQL files. So this is an SQL file, and now your question would be, where do I store these files? Because there is a specific location for each use case in DBT. Like if you want to create test, you store this in test folder. If you want to create seed, then you put it in seed folder. Similarly, when you want to create macros, you put these SQL files in the macros path. Now, how do I know where is the macros path? So you can go to your DBT project in dbt_project.yaml file, and then you can go to these paths and here find macro path, and you will see that this is the macros folder. So here is my macros folder, and whatever macro that I want to create, I will create this in the .sql file over here. We already have a schema_name macro, and I'm going to be explaining this to you when we will be doing the practical implementation. This video is already too long, so I don't want to cover the practical implementations here, because then it will be like an hour or an hour and a half long video. So I will be covering the practical implementation of these use cases in the next video, but I want to cover a few things before we wrap up for this video. And the first thing that I want to cover is some macro best practices. So in macro best practices, always remember that keep macros simple. You don't have to overcomplicate anything. Use meaningful names for the macros, because by just reading the name of the macro, it should be understood that what this macro is doing. This will save you tons of time understanding the code, going into the code and understanding the code behind the macro. I would also say that don't over engineer any stuff. If there is some small logic that needs to be repeated, then there is no point in writing a macro for it, because it is not worth the effort. But if there is a logic which is complicated but is used in multiple places, then I think it is safe to use that as a macro and then use it wherever you're using, so that the complexity can be abstracted. Always document your macros, and like we were documenting the seed files or sources or models, you have to create a YML file. So .yaml file in the macros folder, and then whatever you want to document, you can document over here. So documentation is really important for macros, so that you understand what things are. We will be seeing the documentation again practically in the next video. So these were some of the best practices that I want to put it out there. And let us now jump to another topic, which is common mistakes when we are writing macros. And the first common mistake that happens is we try to write everything as a macro, but that beats the purpose of using a macro. Readability should be there when you're writing macros, when you're writing or using these macros in models or anywhere else. Don't use overcomplicated logic inside the macros. So let me just first write down here, not everything should be written as macro. Do not overcomplicate. And again, do not ignore the readability, because this is highly important. So I want to leave you with one last thought about macros, and I think this will make it really click to you as to what a macro is. And because I love cooking, so I'm going to take an example from the cooking world. So suppose that you want to make cookies and you want to make 100 star shaped cookies. Now you can hand carve each cookie one at a time into a star shape one by one, but this might take forever. Every star looks slightly different and it's kind of exhausting as well. So instead, what you can do is you can take one star shaped cookie cutter, press it on the dough as many times as you like. For us, it is 100 times, and every time that cookie will be identical and perfectly shaped. Later on, if you decide that you don't want to have a star shape but you want to have a moon shape, then you just need to change the cookie cutter, and all the future cookies, they can use this new shape, and you can again use these cookies and make multiple cookies. So these cookie cutters, they are like macros. Pressing into the dough means we are calling the macro in the model. And when we are changing the cutter shape, it means that we are just updating our macro in one place. We don't have to go to those 10,000 places where we have used the logic that we defined in the macro. So this is how the macro fits in. It makes things reusable and helps us deliver work faster and also remain consistent throughout our project. I hope I was able to explain you what a macro is, and I know we have not covered practical implementation in this one, but the next video will be coming next week related to practical implementation of macro. If you have got any questions related to this video, or if I have not covered anything related to macro and you would want to know, then please drop your questions, comments, feedback in the comments below. I would love to get back to you, and if needed, I will also create a video on that particular topic that you have mentioned. Thank you for watching. I will see you in my next one.